We will be commencing with the session 1, theme of which is Evolving Global Environment and Future Wars. This session will analyze the emerging trends in warfare and crystal gaze into the future battlefields. It will also focus on changing contours of land warfare and strengths and vulnerabilities of the forces. For this webinar, each chairperson and the panelists have been given a topic to be covered within the allocated time, that is 15 minutes each to the chair and the panelists. The session is chaired by Lieutenant General Dr. V.K. Ahluwalia, PVSM, AVSM, and BAR YSM VSM. The detailed biodata of each chair and the speakers are given in the brochure. Only the salient aspects will be highlighted during the webinar. The biodata of the esteemed chair is as flashed on the screen. A brief introduction on the illustrious career profile of General Ahluwalia. He superannuated as the General Officer Commanding in Chief, Central Command. Thereafter, he served as the member, Armed Forces Tribunal, Jaipur, Jodhpur benches. He commanded an infantry brigade in Uri sector, mountain division in Kargil, and corps in Leh Ladakh sector. He was also the first Indian brigadier to attend the National Defence Course at Dhaka. A doctorate in internal security and conflict resolution. He has also authored a book, Red Revolution 2020 and Beyond, and co-edited 3 books. General Ahluwalia is presently the Director, Center for Land Warfare Studies. He will be talking about defining future wars and conflicts. The first speaker in the panel is Dr. Andrew Scobell. He is the Distinguished Fellow, China, at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. He focuses on China's armed forces, defense policy, and China's relations with countries and regions around the world, with a particular emphasis on the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan Strait, South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Dr. Scobell has served in multiple capacities at RAND, including a stint as an associate professor at the George H.W. Bush School of Government. He will be speaking today on China-Pakistan relations and its impact on security in the region. He is joining us live from USA. Our sincere appreciation to Dr. Scobell for joining us at an odd hour despite the difficult time zones. Our second speaker for the session is Dr. Timothy Heath. Dr. Heath is a senior international defense researcher at the RAND Corporation. Prior to joining RAND in October 2014, he served as the senior analyst for the US PACOM China Strategic Focus Group. Fluent in Mandarin Chinese, he has extensive experience in analyzing China's national strategy, politics, ideology, and military, as well as the Asian regional security developments. Dr. Heath will be speaking today on changing strategic landscape in Asia and its impact on future conflict. He also joins us live from USA. We thank Dr. Heath for speaking at the event despite the inconvenient time difference. With this, I invite the chair for further proceedings. Over to General Ahluwalia, please.
As the Director, Center for Land Warfare Studies, it's my proud privilege and honor to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished panelists, all the participants who are online, distinguished guests, as also the close fraternity which is now in the Chanakya Hall here. The panelists have already been introduced. They are experts in their fields, and I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting session. Of course, I would like to thank both my panelists because the time in New York is certainly very odd at the moment. Thank you so very much for joining us today. The subject given for this session is Evolving Global Environment and Future Wars. That's the broad theme of the session. And I would like to speak on 2 parts. Very few words about the global environment, and thereafter about the future wars and conflicts. So far we're talking about wars, but we'll also be talking about the conflicts. Let me make a beginning. First of all, the global environment is evolving at a very fast pace. This is something that we have to try and understand and keep pace with. I'd like to make a mention, given the rapid changes in geopolitics, economic, and strategic landscape, we are not very sure whether we are moving towards a bipolar world order or a polycentric world order or a hybrid world order with a superpower and multiple poles. But whatever it may be, such transitions or a run-up to the transitions always have competition, friction, turbulence, and new alignments among the nation states. Let me begin with a theoretical construct on power transition theory. It postulates powerful states will prefer to maintain the leadership of the international order. The weaker states will prefer to challenge the dominant power as they become stronger against it. Now, such transitions always bring in new sets of challenges. Alison Graham, he spoke about the Thucydide traps. Now, what is Thucydide traps? It is basically when a growing power rivals or competes against an already established power. Now, he also goes on to mention in the year 2015, when he wrote this, that over the past 500 years, there have been 16 such situations. Out of those 16 situations, 12 turned into a war. Now, that's a very high figure. This is going to throw many threats and challenges to security. The trend that we see today, especially among the big powers, is that they want to achieve their political or territorial or strategic objectives by ensuring that they do not cross the threshold of an overt war. How do they achieve that? By non-military means or by concealed military use of military force. So what are the tools like? Tools are information warfare, propaganda, fake news, offensive cyber tools, drones, precision-guided munitions, loiter munitions. A lot was spoken by the three service chiefs also. And also, we are now looking at hybrid tools, large number of them, to be operating in a gray zone environment. Now, what is gray zone? We are looking at oscillating between peace and war. They're looking at ambiguity as also to leverage non-attributability. This is one of the trends that we have seen in the recent years. Also is the violent non-state actors. There has been an increase in the violent non-state actors, as also there has been a progressive increase in the intra-state conflicts the world over. We also find that there has been a trend towards aberration of international norms, which actually results in erosion of sovereignty of the nation states. And we find there is a competition among the nation states for oil and energy, also for natural resources, also for markets, which can also lead to conflicts. There is a great change and increase in the non-traditional threats and challenges to security. With that, I will roll on to the defining future wars and conflicts. Now, this particular image that you see is a perfect example of the current operations as also the likely conflicts of the future. What was given out by one of the chief of the air staff, he quoted Plato. Plato, 2,500 years ago, said, and I quote, "Only the dead have seen the end of all wars," unquote. Just about 3 decades ago, Rear Admiral Joseph Weil, while writing on the subject in 1989, said, and I quote, "Despite whatever effort there may be to prevent it, there may be war. Therefore, it will be naive to assume that there will be no conflicts or wars. There will be conflicts and wars, but what is very important is that we may be able to bring out the trends by joining the dots. We may be able to identify the flashpoints the world over, but it is extremely difficult to crystal gauge and to know about the future wars. Few important questions which remain always unanswered, and most of the countries of the world have gone wrong. When and where will the conflict be? Why will the conflict be? When will the trigger be there for a war to commence? and who will fight whom? Who will be the stakeholders? Which alliances will be working? So those are the kind of questions which cannot be answered. We move on to the next. I want to cover three important aspects. What does the CIPRI say in 2021, which has been published? It said, despite the raging pandemic COVID-19 has also a decline in the national economies of the world, there has been a global increase in the military spending world over. The rate of increase in the military spending at the global level has been 2.6%. And in the region-wise, it has been the highest in Africa at 5.1%. And the next to that was Europe, around 4%. The question that arises is, why was such a kind of a situation prevailing? It also said that pandemic did not have a let-up on the armed conflicts. On the contrary, armed conflicts increased during the pandemic period. I want to ask a question. What can be the reason for such an endeavor? Is it because of anxiety? Is it because of some fear? Or is it an occasion to exploit the opportunity to meet political objectives? I just want to make a mention that there were 40% increased war deaths in sub-Sahara Africa in 2020 in comparison to 2019. There was a new war in Ethiopia, in the Tigray province. The war in Yemen was a major humanitarian crisis. The Middle East and North Africa continues to remain the least peaceful region of the world. It has a number of low-intensity conflicts going on. Then we had the conflict in Armenia, Azerbaijan, 44 days war, a shooting war, a decisive war. And ongoing at the moment, crisis in Kazakhstan, as also in Ukraine, and of course in Afghanistan. So therefore, you find that during the pandemic, these kind of conflicts were taking place. Coming further east, you find China's People Liberation Army moves across to contact the line of actual control, the disputed border between India and China, on a wide front at multiple points. It results in military standoff, results in physical scuffles, results in casualties to both sides, though the talks are on and there is some let-up, but yet the situation remains tense and the military standoff continues. If you go further east, you find South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, they continue to remain in news and remain tense. So that is the kind of situation that you're seeing during the pandemic. Now, having a look at two more issues. What are the known trends? I want to move from the known trends to look at the factors which shape the wars and contours. Have a look at this particular slide. You'll find that up to 1945, it was predominantly interstate wars. Post 1945, it was a progressive increase in the intrastate conflict from mid 1950s when decolonization commenced. There was a progressive increase at an accelerated pace in the intrastate conflict, and it is also known as the golden period of insurgencies and terrorism. Almost 95% of the conflicts since 45 have been intrastate, civil wars. And look at this recent conflicts. Some have already been mentioned in the inaugural session. I would like to make a mention that these conflicts that we spoke about in the Middle East, North Africa, in Central Asian republics, the Ukraine or Afghanistan, all of them suggest that there is the involvement of regional and extra-regional powers. There are regulars, irregulars, state actors, non-state actors. There are contractual forces, private military companies, media, and non-contact warfare. If you now look at the range of tools that have been used in the recent conflicts, please have a look. Overt, covert, subversion, sabotage, terrorism, proxies, violent non-state actors, private military companies, information warfare, which means psychological warfare, cyber, drones, color revolutions, political and diplomatic pressures on the countries, economic sanctions, strategic alignments. I can add more, artificial intelligence and the applications. I can add more, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance being so very accurate to target. So this is a kind of a conventional, come more unconventional in using hybrid tools. Let's have a look at the armed conflicts by types. There's a clear increase in the interstate conflicts, and there's a decline in the interstate conflicts. Look at the region-wise. Africa tops, next comes Asia, then comes Middle East. Very interestingly, let's have a relationship between internal armed conflicts and terrorism. This is given by the Institute for Economics and Peace. You find that there's a trajectory is almost the same. So there is a great relationship between terrorism moves in line with the ongoing internal armed conflicts. And this trend is going to continue. Look at the non-state conflicts. Non-state conflict talks about two organized armed groups, not government forces. Look at the trend. It is still moving and likely to continue. This is another very important aspect is the age profile. Wherever you have had young demographic with mass unemployment, poor governance, poor state structures, socio-economic inequality, you find that in this particular case, as you see, that Africa, Asia, Central America, and Northern America are all in their teens and in their 20s. And this is also the area where we have maximum number of conflicts. Please have a look. According to, this was the figure of 2014, but in 2020, India's median age is 28.4 and China is 38.4. If you look at Africa, a large number of countries are in their teens. And that's the area, it's said in SIPRI as also the Uppsala site, that in 2020, they recorded 56 state-based conflicts, of which 8 were actually wars. Of those 56, 30 were in Africa. And now you have a look at this oval-shaped figure, and how does Institute for Economics and Peace say about the Global Terrorism Index? Same countries with very young profile are also the epicenter of internal armed conflicts and terrorism. This was the study which said it is because of the state structural factors, socio-economic and cultural factors, foreign occupation. The age of the insurgents and terrorists was in the age of 17 to 30 years, unemployment, socio-economic exclusion, and so on. I now go on to the next part, what are the factors that shape the contours of future wars? Geopolitics is the mother of them all. I am not going to cover them in any detail because we have both the panelists who are going to speak on the subject, but very important one, the recent developments which resulted in geopolitical competition, instability in Middle East, North Africa, as also the US pull out of the US and the NATO forces from Afghanistan and the instability that occurs over there, as also what is happening in Kazakhstan and Ukraine as we see today. You find that this Eurasian landmass is now into a huge geopolitical competition, which is detrimental to stability and peace at the international level. China's rise is well known over the last 2 decades, as also that China has been assertive and aggressive. They have moved on with the Belt and Road Initiative into Asia, into Africa, into Central Asian areas, as also into Central and Eastern Europe, with a view to achieve political, economic, and strategic advantages. I'll leave it at that. How does it affect South Asia? So Mr. Scobell is going to cover that, or Mr. Timothy. But I'd just like to make a mention that as China moves into the Indian Ocean region and there's a strategic encirclement, we also find that China is increasingly shaping the geopolitics of the countries in South Asia, particularly those which are in close vicinity and immediate neighbors of India. I won't touch upon Pakistan and China's effort because that's another subject being dealt by my colleague. Geopolitics and geoeconomics are actually complementary. Geoeconomics influences geopolitics. Let me give you an example. Economic center of gravity has progressively moved from the west to the east, and so also the balance of power. According to a study in 2030, when we have four large economies, three economies, larger economies of the world would be in Asia: China, India, and Japan. And therefore, you will find that this balance of power is certainly moving to the east. The latest, on 25th January, announced by Mrs. Geeta Gopinath, IMF Global Growth Forecast 2022, it says global economy has declined to grow at 4.4%, US at 4%, China has again come down to 4.8%, China at one point of time grew at 15% in 2007, and India from 9.5% to 9%, it continues to remain with the tag of being the fastest growing major economy of the world. That's a good news. But I would like to draw your attention to what Michael Beckley said in 2019, and I quote, "China's economic conditions have declined steadily since 2008 financial crisis." Then goes on to say, when rising powers have suffered such slowdowns in the past, they become repressive at home and more aggressive abroad. Unquote. Very briefly on disinformation and psychological campaigns, social media is the prime tool, along with the state-sponsored media tools, whether electronic or print. You find it has twofold aim. One is to change the perception of the public at large to one's advantage. Second is to undermine the political institutions of the adversary. Therefore, this is something which is going to pick up much more in the future. Talking about cyberspace, electromagnetic, and artificial intelligence, these four are the much more contested domains, and today as also in the future. China, in a white paper on defense in 2015, said that in the information age, the future wars will be fought in the information domain. Hence, you find a great amount of emphasis on informationization by the China's PLA. But coming to 2017, in a study by Science of Strategy, NDU, in 2017, it said the PLA's view on warfare, it envisions system of systems confrontation. Warfare will be conducted on tangible and intangible battlefields. The tangible battlefields include land, sea, air, and space domains. But the more important portion is, while the intangible battlefield includes the electromagnetic spectrum, cyber, space, and psychological cognition. Now, this is something that we have to take a note of. Therefore, you find countries world over are developing their cyber capabilities. The Belfer Center, as also the IISS, have conducted studies on the development of cyber capabilities. I just mentioned 5 countries here, but they have given a list of almost 15 countries: US, China, UK, Russia, Canada, and so on. Because they realize the importance of cyber in the information age. Space, we find that there's a proliferation of military and commercial activities in the space, due to which these are being contested. These can be the sources of conflict in the future. So also is nuclear. You find that there's proliferation of tactical nuclear weapons, and those regulations are not being adhered to. These are also sources of great conflict in the future. This is the most important portion to us is the geopolitics in South Asia, though it will be covered, but I just want to cover the fact that historical legacies. World over, most of the countries have got territorial boundary disputes, water sharing disputes. We in our countries certainly have 2 of our land boundary and territorial disputes with Pakistan and with China, and this continues to remain a source of conflict. Can result in a conflict, though may be limited, but it is a source that we have to be careful. What is very important is all the 3 countries maintain no loss of territory. In fact, about 3 years ago, President Xi Jinping is on record to say, and I quote, there will be no loss of territory by China given to it by its predecessors, unquote. When you have this kind of a syndrome, then all the negotiations don't really make much headway. So this continues to remain as a source of conflict. But this is something that we have to get over. China and the Indian Ocean region will be covered by my colleagues, but I want to make a mention that South Asia continues to remain at the epicenter of terrorism. And with China and Pakistan being all-weather friends, we have to consider the fact that there could be a collusive threat in the future as we move along. I would like to quote Michael Henlon. He writes in The Future of Land Warfare. He writes, and I quote, "On balance, it is hard to escape the conclusion that South Asia contains major potential for large-scale operations, for ground forces, whether in the context of interstate conflicts, severe internal violence, or complex humanitarian catastrophe due to a number of natural disasters." Unquote. So this is something that we have to be careful, and we should be seized and aware of this in the South Asian context. I've already mentioned about the historical legacy as to how territorial compounded disputes tend to linger on and are a source of conflict, but all countries are wanting to develop their military capabilities to narrow down the gap between the two countries. Basically, the areas of development of capabilities lie in developing niche technologies, developing asymmetric capabilities in terms of artificial intelligence, swarm of drones, loitering munitions, EGMs, and the kind. There's also hybrid tools, and to operate in a gray zone environment where they want to maintain ambiguity and leverage non-attributability. This again, demography and societal tension I've already mentioned earlier. Climate change, though does not affect in a short term, it may affect after 30, 40, 50 years. The fact to remember is that we in the world, due to global warming, would expect almost 1 degree Celsius increase in the temperature by the time we reach 2100, which actually means sea levels will rise to very unacceptable levels. Countries around South China Sea, Bangladesh, India, Maldives, in this region are certainly going to be affected by the climate change purely on account of temperatures. Of course, I'm not talking about water scarcity and the other environmental stresses because of paucity of time, but we can do that in the question and answer session. What I have really covered in a very quick time are these are the factors which are considered for shaping the contours of future wars and conflicts. With that, I will now request my next panelist, Dr. Andrew Scobell, Distinguished Fellow, to please make his presentation. Heath.
All right. Well, it's a great pleasure to address such an august audience, albeit virtually. What I've going to speak about in the next few minutes is China's relationship with Pakistan and its impact on South Asia. And what I'm about to say represents my own views, not those of my current employer, the U.S. Institute of Peace, or my former employer, the RAND Corporation. That said, the information I'm presenting is based on analysis and research I conducted when I was at RAND, and much of the information has been published in RAND reports. Oops. Before focusing on Pakistan and South Asia, I think it's important I'm focusing on the Chinese, understanding Chinese perspective, looking at what's driving China's great leap outward to the world, to the wider world. And since the late 1970s, China has adopted a so-called policy of reform and opening to the outside world. But what this really means is an emphasis, the priority being the modernization and growth of China's economy. So the most important driver of China's great leap outward is to stimulate the growth of China's economy. In subsequent decades, another important driver was a desire for greater global influence and also to correspondingly counter U.S. influence around the world. In more recent decades, as China has become a global power, global in the sense that China is present and engaged in virtually every country and region around the world, more attention to Chinese overseas interests. The term overseas interests has become prominent in Chinese writings and thinking of Chinese strategists, while core interests or China's vital interests tend to have a greater attention. These overseas interests are increasingly important. What are we talking about? It's really people and stuff. Chinese citizens increasingly in the hundreds of thousands live, work, and travel abroad, both as students, as business people, and tourists. And China has assets and infrastructure in countries and regions around the world. And in a good number of these locations, conditions are of the kind that was described by the previous speaker. They're unstable, even dangerous. And so how to protect these overseas interests is an increasing concern of Chinese leaders. Also, a broader trying to understand Chinese thinking about the world. When Chinese leaders look out from Beijing, they see the world through four concentric circles. These are, I call them rings of insecurity, because fundamentally, even as China grows stronger, Chinese leaders remain insecure. And the most important ring of security is that which contains within China's borders, domestic security and stability and continued Communist Party rule. Beyond that are three external rings. The next most important is the ring that encompasses China's immediate periphery. Beyond that, a third ring encompassing China's Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific neighborhood, and then the fourth ring encompassing the rest of the world. And in each of these rings, China has identified key countries that it considers important to cooperate with to advance Chinese interests and expand Chinese influence. And each of the five countries on this graphic are also identified by Beijing as being particularly important in a specific region of the world, as being what I've dubbed a pivotal regional partner, because that country is considered to be particularly important within a specific region. So in Central Asia, that country, for China, that country is Russia. In South Asia, for China, that pivotal regional partner is Pakistan. Further afield in the Middle East, that influential country with which China wishes to cooperate closely is Iran. In Africa, that country seems to be South Africa. Even further afield in Latin America, that country seems to be Venezuela. Going from the global, broader global perspective, narrowing to South Asia. Within South Asia, and China does pay attention, as I've sort of intimated, to regions. It has a global approach, global interests, but it does pay close attention and seems to have a region by region strategy. In South Asia, China's regional priorities appear to be emphasizing China's internal stability, but this internal stability refers to China's far west, namely the autonomous regions of Tibet and Xinjiang, which, while sparsely populated, tend to be disproportionately inhabited by ethnic minorities, in particular Tibetans and Uyghurs, these ethnic groups spill across borders and so South Asia, a high priority for China is to ensure that South Asia does not create or push instability within China. In addition, protecting China's growing economic interests in the region is important, as well as balancing against the most powerful country in the region, which China views as a serious rival or competitor. To further these priorities, China is engaged in a range of activities, political, economic, and military. Focus on Pakistan. As I mentioned a moment ago, Pakistan is, from Beijing's perspective, the most important country in South Asia, with which China must cooperate with to attain or advance its priorities and interests in the region. It's no exaggeration to call Pakistan the linchpin of China's South Asia policy. As I mentioned, the sub-bullets reinforce what I've already said, but I would highlight that Pakistan, from China's perspective, is not just important vital for regional stability in South Asia, but it also for Central Asia, most immediately in Afghanistan. But Afghanistan and Pakistan is seen as maintaining stability there is seen as key to ensuring that the Central Asian stands remain stable as well. And of course, Pakistan's other value for China, from China's perspective, is as a counterweight to India. Pakistan's importance to China is underscored by the fact that it's the largest market international market for Chinese weapons, and it's also now it seems arguably the most important country in China's global Belt and Road Initiative. Important in the sense that it seems that China's invested more in Pakistan than it has in any other country. So Pakistan has been important to Beijing since at least the 1960s. There are elements of continuity as well as elements of change. In terms of continuity, there is, as one leading expert on the relationship has said, an unusual level of mutual trust between Beijing and Islamabad. And this Chinese society, Chinese culture is rather has low levels of trust, and trust takes a long time to be built up between individuals and countries. And so the extent of good relations between the many decades of good relations between China and Pakistan have engendered a significant level of trust, which you don't see, which is quite rare between China and other countries. These levels of trust have allowed, permitted sustained levels, high levels of security cooperation. And then following from that, it should be no surprise that Pakistan is China's closest and most enduring friend anywhere in the world. In terms of change, Pakistan has, from China's perspective, has seen its global geopolitical significance decreased, while on the other hand, Pakistan's regional geostrategic importance to China has risen in recent decades. The reason, that many decades ago, Pakistan was an important gateway for China to the rest of the world, especially to the Islamic world and to the Middle East. But today, China has direct and good relations with many countries, most countries in the Middle East, and many Islamic countries. So Pakistan's relevance or importance in that dimension is much less important. Also in recent years, another change has been China has broadened out its reach to countries across South Asia. Xi Jinping, for example, has visited most of the countries in the region. That was before COVID. He was quite active visiting countries of South Asia, including being the first Chinese head of state to visit the Maldives. This has seen a broadening out of China's attention to countries across the region beyond Pakistan. But at the same time, China has in many ways doubled down in Pakistan, both in terms of political terms, in economic terms, and also military terms. So to wrap up, I think it's worth posing some key, some important questions. I think it's far be it for me to answer any of these authoritatively. I think there's a good case can be made for multiple answers. But how best to describe the China-Pakistan relationship? Many different terms have been used. Some claim it's an alliance. I would say it's not quite an alliance, but it's certainly China-Pakistan relations have a significant security component and many alliance-like characteristics. In terms of the future of China-Pakistan relations, I think anything's possible, but based on their durability over the last many decades, I think that is quite likely to continue. And in terms of stability, I think that's they're likely to continue relations are likely to continue quite on a stable basis. And again, why do I say that? It's because despite the many tensions and bumps in the relationship between the two countries, in the past they've managed to maintain a steady friendship, steady cooperative relationship. In terms of what the impact of China-Pakistan relations are on the South Asia region, I think there are contradictory impulses. There are some elements of this relationship that nurture stability, others foment instability. There are some elements of China-Pakistan relations that are conducive to peace, others that contribute to conflict. But I would say overall, China's influence on Pakistan has been generally conducive to stability in South Asia, and supportive of peace in in South Asia, albeit a very uneasy peace. I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
You have actually given out China's interests and concerns overseas. As also, very interestingly, you brought out those 3 external rings and 5 key countries that China looks at: Pakistan, Russia, Iran, South Africa, and Venezuela, in the different circles, different continents. And I do agree with you, your rationale that you gave regarding Pakistan's significance to China. But maybe there will be a large number of questions to you after Dr. Timothy speaks as to how does it unfold in real terms, as we see they all whether friendship, partnership, or as an ally. Thank you so very much. And of course, we will have a question answer session soon after Dr. Timothy gives his presentation. We look forward to you to please remain with us. I know it's a very uncomfortable time, but let's be together for some more time. Now, may I request Dr. Timothy Heath, Senior International Defense Researcher, to kindly make his presentation.
Sir, good afternoon and good night to my friend and colleague, Dr. Scobell. Good to see you. It is an honor and a real pleasure to be able to speak with the scholars of clause, and I look forward very much to the questions and answers. My topic that I was asked to speak on concerns the idea of strategic partnerships. And really, this is a story about changing international relationships and changing foreign policies around the world, but especially for countries in this Asia, Eurasia, Africa, Middle East regions that the clause director spoke of in his presentation, excellent presentation in the patterns of conflict. I want to begin my presentation with just an observation that it is these broader trends in conflict that are in part responsible for the attractiveness of the idea of strategic partnerships. And I hope to explore that a little bit in the following slides. But before I do, let me first state that what I'm presenting are my own views. They are based on research done at RAND. I've published some of the research findings in my analysis regarding China's foreign policy. And I'm also doing some ongoing research, which I look forward to publishing soon, that really gets at this issue from a different angle. And that angle is this broader issue of the disintegration and transformation of the nation state. I really think it's a very important factor we haven't discussed yet today, but it is, I think, crucial to understand what is going on with all these nation states, these governments around the world, especially in the developing world. Is some very interesting and I think very far-reaching transformations that are happening, and that doubtless play a role in the trends in future warfare. Please, can I ask the folks who are running the slides for me to advance one slide? Thank you. So what I will be discussing are some of the trends that are behind the interest in strategic partnerships. I will talk about strategic partnerships as a concept. What are they? And then I'll spend a few minutes discussing the U.S. approach to strategic partnerships and China's approach before moving on to some concluding thoughts. Next slide. So to begin, there are several political and economic trends, some of which were covered in the previous presentations. So I will simply touch on them briefly here. But you find with the United States and NATO and Western developed countries in general, a considerable polarization domestically in their politics and retrenchment, in the sense that a lot of Western countries have shown a disinterest in getting involved in overseas wars. It's one reason why there has been a decline in interstate wars. But going along with the retrenchment politically in the West, you are also seeing economic decline of Western countries and growing economic strength in the non-West. What this suggests is that Western countries, as they see their relative share of global power decline, will be looking for new partners to strengthen their influence, open opportunities, and bolster the international order. And this also suggests there will be opportunities for rising countries to establish new partnerships and build relationships with some of these Western countries who will be more receptive than perhaps they were in the past. Another geopolitical trend, which we have touched on, is China's rise and the realignments that are happening in Asia. China's economic power is well documented, and I don't need to say a whole lot more here. But one implication is that China also will be eager to build its own network of what I call client states. These are countries that depend on China economically to some extent and politically rely on Chinese leadership and influence to help them achieve their own goals. And in return, China expects greater deference on some political issues, for example, and on perhaps economic cooperation. So China has laid out the vision of the Belt and Road Initiative, and in many ways you could say that the Belt and Road Initiative is a vision in which there are a network of countries who to varying degrees become clients and dependent on China. And China is, a lot of its foreign policy is looking to build relationships with these countries that allow Beijing to have more influence and ability to direct events and protect Chinese interests around the world. There are other trends. Again, we've touched on them in some of the other presentations. The upheaval in the Islamic world, there is upheaval in Europe with some of the conflict going on with Russia and the migrant crisis that is occurring there. The European Union is divided, as we haven't seen such division in the EU in decades, with the Britain leaving the EU and other countries experiencing their own turmoil. And then, thank you. And then, hold on one second before we go to the next one. And then again, there is, as the Belt and Road Initiative shows, a hunger for new markets and resources for countries around the world. So these trends provide incentives for countries to seek a strategic partnership. Okay, next slide, please. What are strategic partnerships? These are bilateral or multilateral relationships that are based on economic, political, and security cooperation. China has been a very active proponent of the idea of strategic partnerships. It's a very flexible type of relationship. It's consistent with China's aversion to alliances. They oppose alliances for political reasons. And in many ways, partnerships, this very vague form of relationship, is very suitable for a fluid post-Cold War era. I found a study published in 2011 by some Indian scholars that ranked India's strategic partners. And I put them on the slide here. I'm not sure if this is the exact same ranking that Indian officials or Indian scholars would hold today, but I thought it was an interesting data point showing both interest in India in the idea of strategic partnership and a snapshot of how at least some Indian scholars view the most appealing partners. You know, I want to add one more thought here, and that is that strategic partnerships, unlike alliances, are not confined necessarily to national governments. China's definition of strategic partners is very open and can include multilateral groups of governments, such as the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It can also include non-state actors like political parties, or other interest groups. And China has been very deliberate in choosing this kind of open-ended definition, I think in part because China sees in its many BRI countries this contested and fragmented politics, which has become more and more common, especially in countries in Africa and along some of these BRI routes. Next slide, please. If we look at the United States has shown an interest in strategic partnerships and has published official documents on the importance of strategic partners. The shift occurred after the Cold War, when the US became interested in a more flexible approach to security partnerships and cooperation. The US also has found strategic partnerships useful to address a broad range of issues. It carries, in general, fewer obligations. So in some ways, it carries less risk for the United States. And according to the US State Department website, here are some examples of bilateral, multilateral partnerships. Again, it's not necessarily just national governments. The US has formed partnerships with multilateral groups as well. And obviously, the US has built a strategic partnership with India and is very interested in cultivating that relationship. Next slide, please. China, as I said, is similarly building up its own network of strategic partnerships. The BRI provides sort of this roadmap for where China hopes to build out this network of cooperative relationships. Dr. Scobell outlined some of the priority countries, which I concur with. There are a few key countries in regions that China views as very important. But as I mentioned, partners can be subnational actors as well. And I think that carries some interesting implications in the future if we think about how China may get involved and support either political parties or non-state actors in countries that are experiencing a lot of conflict or distress. A good example is Afghanistan, where the Chinese were quick to build a partnership with the Taliban when they saw that the national government was losing control of the government of the country. And I think that is very symptomatic of the Chinese approach, very flexible, very open to who it regards as the most important partner in any country. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on, please. And I'm hoping to leave more time for our questions and answers. So last slide. Strategic partnerships are probably going to become a more and more defining feature of international politics. They offer a lot of advantages. They're very appealing to countries like the United States, China, India. These big countries are looking to build cooperative relationships that are flexible, that can be adapted that can help address a broad range of issues and that carry fewer obligations than traditional alliances. It is very possible that these, in fact, it's already happening. These partnerships overlap. They involve multiple partners. It's very common for a country to have strategic partnerships with the U.S. and China and India. The partnership can be compatible with a great deal of competition or cooperation, and could offer a venue to address a lot of shared concerns, including maybe pandemics or terrorism. So I think it will remain very appealing and of interest to build these kind of relationships to the governments in Washington, Beijing, and perhaps New Delhi. I'll pause there, and I look forward to questions and answers with all of you. Thank you.
And economic trends which lead to incentives for strategic partnership. I also find very revealing thoughts given on your US and China strategic partnership. I would say that the point that you made about India's top strategic partners ranked Russia, the US, and France, but that study pertains to FNCR of 2011. Am I correct? That study pertains to 2011.
Yes, sir. That is the source as put on the slide.
That was the thought in 2011. Maybe would you like to think on 2022? Are we the same ranking with Russia, US, and France? Maybe we can answer that during the question and answer session. But I'd like to thank you for a very insightful and very thought-provoking presentation given for you. We have a question from Lieutenant General Anil Ahuja. You have suggested, Dr. Scobell, the question is for Dr. Scobell. You suggest that China-Pakistan relationship tends to increase stability and to promote peace in South Asia. An interesting hypothesis which generally runs counter to India's perception. Could you please amplify? And may I also, in the meantime, give the second question so that Dr. Timothy can think it over. The question is by Mr. Samir Srivastav. He says that China has benefited from the rules-based international order. Would China like to upset them? Can China replace the existing order with its own set of rules? So you can first have Dr. Scobell, please.
Thanks for the question. I think my actual case explanation was a little more nuanced than the questioner implied. I think there's elements of the relationship which are not conducive to stability or peace, and then elements that are. But I said overall, I think the general influence of China on Pakistan is probably net positive, although that's a subjective assessment. I think I guess an important reason for saying that, making that assessment, is that China has little interest or little in having conflict or instability or war in South Asia. So I think it acts as a moderating influence on Pakistan. But that said, there's always the potential for unintended conflict, and some of the things that China is doing in Pakistan or elsewhere in other South Asian countries may actually, much as China would not intend it, could create instability. Let me give you one quick example. That the mantra that you hear, the assumption that's widely given about interpretation about the Belt and Road Initiative is that it's China practicing debt trap diplomacy. That is, that it's China's intentional goal is to mire countries in debt and then basically own or take over those countries or dominate those countries. I don't think that's actually true. But that could happen as an unintended consequence, and the reason is because China's not been particularly astute about the way it goes about financing these Belt and Road initiatives, and indeed selecting the most economically beneficial projects. If the unintended results of Chinese activity, say in the economic realm, could be political instability, economic, social unrest, and this would be, whether it's in Pakistan or another country, I would suggest an unintended consequence. But to that extent, I think China could unintentionally be a force or a contribute to instability and turmoil, even though its intent, its priorities would suggest otherwise. Thank you.
First, Dr. Heath, would you like to answer the question that I posed?
Sure. The question was about the rules-based international order and China's approach to it. My own view is that China's approach is one of what I call renovation. If you can imagine a house, there are different ways to change a house to change it in a way you like it. One way is to demolish and rebuild it. That would be overthrowing the international order and building a new one. I don't think China can or even wants to do that. Another approach was simply to live in the house and make small changes, like just move some furniture. That would be to simply to maintain the international order with little change. I don't think China's interested in that either. And then the third option is to renovate, which is to live in the same house, but you change parts of the house that you don't like. You can have some walls removed and others replaced, and repaint and reconfigure the interior as you like. And I think that's the best analogy for China's approach. They want to modify aspects of the international order to better suit China's own needs while maintaining the overall structure. And the way for them to do that is to build, as I said, I think they need a constituency to support their goals. And the constituency is this network of partner countries around the world who share at least some or many of China's own political goals regarding the international order, rules-based order. And this, I think, helps explain why the Chinese, at least helps in part explain why the Chinese are investing so much effort into influence operations, into this very aggressive diplomacy to shape the policies of other countries, their interest in this united front tactics where they build party-to-party relations and try to influence the agenda items and the politics of political parties or scholars or other elites. So, and this is the issue with international politics: is to be effective, you need a network of supporters. China does not have a strong network in the way the US does. And so it is imperative for China to build up that network of friendly, supportive countries. If you look at the maps on the BRI routes, those appear to be, with Russia as one of the more important partners. Those countries along the BRI routes seem like top candidates for China to try to build a client-state type relationship. Thank you.
Sure, Dr. Timothy, but only point I hope in trying to modify the rules in South China Sea, it is not detrimental to the interest of the other countries who are utilizing those navigation routes. We have one question from Major General Atul Rawat. Please ask your question.
My question is to Dr. Timothy Heath. Talking about China, sir, we feel that China is now, as you yourself mentioned in your presentation, that is directly challenging the world order led by the USA, and it's also taking various actions, particularly in the niche domain, to increase its area of influence. And like the chair mentioned, specifically we have seen actions in the South China Sea, which have been a major cause of concern, not only to the nations around South China Sea, but to the entire international community. And in your presentation, sir, you mentioned that US is also facing this polarization and retrenchment. And when you look at last 10 odd years, you have Mr. Xi Jinping, who's the helm of affairs of China. And to be fair to him, not only has he been strong within his own country, he has been strong outside his country. And we don't see a similar thing happening, at least in the USA. Naturally, the rest of the world looks at USA for leadership. When that kind of leadership does not come from USA, you have China taking up the space vacated by USA. Sir, going ahead, looking next 10 years, do you think that can be reversed, and how? Thank you.
Thank you for the very astute and insightful observations about, yes, indeed, the U.S. is having a lot of domestic stress, you could say, polarization. But if I may add one thing to your comment, I would suggest that the Chinese are actually also experiencing intense internal stress. There's a reason why China's internal security budget since 2011 has exceeded their military budget. And the heightened repression under Xi Jinping, although it has made him stronger in some ways, the fact that the Chinese government has had to resort to these measures to maintain stability suggests that there is a great deal of internal stress and different kinds of political pressure going on within China. We see this most clearly in Xinjiang and Tibet, which has experienced upswings in terrorism and violence. And the Chinese have responded with a very brutal crackdown, genocidal effort to suppress and almost wipe out the distinctive Uyghur identity. So China is also going through a lot of domestic stress, as is the US. This gets to my broader point that I made at the start of my briefing. Nation states, including the US and China, are experiencing a lot of stress. And I think their ability to commit a lot of resources to war against each other is very limited because they have their hands full grappling with primarily non-state threats. COVID-19 is just, I think, a very good illustration of the global era we are in, and the kinds of pressures that are being applied on governments. Terrorism is another example. The U.S. and China are dealing with it. Let me just conclude with a comment on South China Sea. I agree. A lot of countries oppose China's position on the South China Sea, but China is strong enough that it is able to, so far, get away with what it is doing. And very few countries want to risk conflict with China, even though they may disagree. Question is, in the future, will this continue, or will countries change their minds? I think if China continues to avoid outright military attack and violence, and respects merchant trade through that region, then it will be difficult for countries to, I think I assess that the risk of war will remain limited, although there will be more and more perhaps diplomatic cooperation to criticize and resist additional Chinese encroachments there. Thank you.
Just before I proceed any further with the questions, I just would like to inform the distinguished panelists that both your presentations have evoked a huge amount of response. I am flooded with large number of questions. So I request you to keep your questions, your answers a little brief so that I can put across all the questions to you. We have a question by General Rakesh Sharma.
Thank you, Dr. Heath. My question relates to your formulation on strategic partnerships. And I would like to state that most of these strategic partnerships are just about talking shop. Finally, it's an increasingly Westphalian model where countries are more and more thinking about individual sovereignties and what is suitable for them. And in doing so, this influence that one wants to gain by strategic partnership is not a currency of power, because finally any country will think his own manner, and all these partnerships will mean little in the long run. So would you say that the strategic partnership are just for some time, they are not a long drawn advantage to any one of these nations, sir?
That's a fair point. They can appear as nothing more than talk shops. It's really going to depend case by case. I do think in some cases, having a partnership establishes a level of trust that allows collaboration on economic cooperation, perhaps. BRI is a good example. The Quad is an example of partnerships that is delivering some benefits on vaccines, on technology, on security. There are some benefits, but I think it is a fair point. A lot of them can be nothing more than talk shops, and we should bear that in mind when we see any news report about a new strategic partnership. Thank you.
We have a question by Mr. Mohak Gambhir. What do you think are the key vulnerabilities as far as China-Pakistan strategic partnership is concerned? For instance, we have been witnessing mass protests in Gwadar city in Balochistan against CPEC, which is a key bilateral area of cooperation. Dr. Scobell, would you like to take this?
It's a really good, excellent observation. And if you were to be sitting in, if you or I were to be sitting in Beijing and deciding what's a good place to invest in, I don't think I certainly, if I were sitting there, I wouldn't see Pakistan as a great place to invest, because it's a rather unstable, tumultuous place, and yet China has decided to, as I said, double down on Pakistan and throw a lot of investment and a lot of infrastructure projects. Why? Because I think they see, as I said, they see Pakistan as very important, a key partner and a key player in South Asia, and yet there are risks involved, and I guess that's the larger point. If China is, I think, as Dr. Heath mentioned, they are experiencing major stresses at home, and they're focusing considerable resources to deal with domestic challenges, and so logically one would say they would restrict or limit their overseas activities, but we're not seeing that. And I think that's because Chinese leaders have drunk the Kool-Aid of globalization. They believe that China's future is tied up with the rest of the world. And that engagement with the rest of the world comes with risks. And so those risks exist in particular, especially in Pakistan, but also in other countries. But China seems willing to tolerate those risks in Pakistan and elsewhere.
Again, we have a question for you, Dr. Scobell, from Dr. Jyoti Patania. She says, considering the status of CPEC, do you think China's making inroads into Pakistan's hinterland will either improve or thaw the relations between them and thereby affect South Asia?
It's a great question, and I honestly don't know the answer. But I think it's it's as I suggested, it's China's taking calculated risks, and these but China should know. I think has considerable familiarity with Pakistan. It's been engaged in Pakistan for many decades now, and a good number of Chinese citizens have died or been injured or kidnapped over the years. So there should be no illusions of by Beijing of the challenges Chinese companies and businesses and citizens face in Pakistan, and then as I suggested earlier, there is on the one hand, if these projects are successful in developing the infrastructure in Pakistan and improving the Pakistani economy, that could be conducive. That could be conducive to stability in the country. And yet, if it's not successful, if it's mishandled or faces major popular opposition, then it could actually foment instability in Pakistan. So I think the jury's still out on what the ultimate impact outcome of Chinese influence in Pakistan will be.
Thank you, Dr. Scobell. We have a question from Colonel Ajinkya. He is a paratrooper.
So my question is to Dr. Scobell, sir. So you mentioned in your presentation that in the emerging global world order, where China, Pakistan, Russia, and I would also include Turkey, is actually is emerging as a partner or an alliance or an axis. So the geographical location of India is very centered to this particular region, sir, which has borders with Pakistan along its west and along its north, it has China, sir. So to counter this particular alliance, what is, as per your analysis, your views on Quad being developed as an alliance to counter this polarity, sir?
Thanks for the question. I think what China's doing are building, relationships, bilateral relationships, and so I don't see there being a multilateral alliance network or even network beyond. China's really emphasizing bilateral relations, even in organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China uses that as an umbrella entity and works very much bilaterally under that umbrella. So I don't see this. I don't see China developing an alliance network. And of course, the Quad, as Dr. Heath mentioned, that is not an alliance either. These are. I'm not saying that India has nothing to worry about, but I think these threats or challenges can be exaggerated. Thank you.
A number of questions at hand with me, but I have just got a message that perhaps you would not like to take on any more questions at the moment. But I'd like to leave a thought with you that as China is increasingly shaping the geopolitics of the countries around South China Sea, as it also expands into the Indian Ocean region, it increasingly shapes the geopolitics of the countries in India's immediate neighborhood. How do you see this situation from America, from your perspective? And secondly, Mr. Timothy, I wanted to ask you again that study was of 2011. What, in your view, is India's strategic partners today? Those you ranked as Russia, US, and France. I just want to ask you, what is your view today after a decade? So maybe we'll just have these two questions from you at the moment. And of course, third, what Dr. Scobell is that we have a land boundary, territorial dispute with our western neighbor and the northern neighbor. And when you look at China-Pakistan relationships, they are all-weather friends. How do you see this situation because of the land border and boundary dispute? Because we have fought wars on this very areas of disputes. After that, I think we'll call the question answers. Timothy, you may answer first, please.
Yes, thank you for the questions. The first question, as I understood it, is China's rise. How does the United States view China's growing power and coercive power in South China Sea and throughout Asia? Well, very clearly the U.S. is concerned. The U.S., since President Trump, has identified China as a top concern. That's a stark change from the previous administrations, which were very careful not to say that. President Biden has maintained that position that China is a top concern, and the U.S., as you well know, studying the news, is putting effort into building relationships with countries like India, Japan, Australia, countries throughout Southeast Asia, in part to balance against Chinese power, and this reflects deep concern that military assets are being moved to Asia. There is a rebalancing going on, and there's an effort to expand not just military but security, technological, and health and economic cooperation as well. So I think the U.S. is trying very hard. I think the U.S. government recognizes it cannot do it by itself. It needs countries in the region and outside the region. Britain even can be involved to help maintain stability in the Asia Pacific through cooperation. As far as India's top partners, I confess I'm not an expert on India and India's position. My observation would be, though, since 2011, several things should affect considerations for India. First off, India's energy dependence has increased significantly, and so countries in the Middle East are going to be more important for India's future. Second, Russia's power has declined dramatically, and its closer alignment with China, I would think, would make Russia drop in importance, though certainly still important to India. I'm not so sure it would rate as highly today. Third, I think the U.S. willingness to stand up to China and to offer itself as a partner to balance against China, and its role in Pakistan would make the U.S. very appealing as a partner for India. I'll pause there. I'm sure you guys are much more insightful into some of the specific needs of India, but those are just some observations I'll share. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Dr. Scobell, last question before we break.
So the first question, I think, was about how the U.S. sees China's increased assertiveness across the Indo-Pacific region and even around the world. Well, I think this is certainly viewed with alarm and contributes to the assessment that China presents the greatest traditional security threat, state-centric threat to the United States. But I think there's some, on the one hand, that's alarming. But on the other hand, what China's managed to do as a result of being so assertive and so aggressive on so many fronts is change the thinking of so many countries in so many capitals around the world that used to see China primarily as an opportunity. Now they see China as a threat, or at best a mixed bag. And what this means is there are lots of countries around the world that are interested in working with, cooperating with, coordinating with other countries and the United States to try and push back against these Chinese actions, whether it's in the South China Sea or elsewhere. So I think that's what the Biden administration is trying to do. Focus more on allies and partners. Whether they'll be successful or not, that's another question. In terms of the boundary disputes, these boundary disputes with Pakistan and China, of course, have been ongoing for decades, and there doesn't seem to be any resolution in sight. On the one hand, they seem manageable. I don't mean to make it sound like all's well, but what I mean by that is manageable in the sense that they don't seem so that likely to escalate into a major conflict. And when you, I think what helps explain what I mean is when you look at the 2020 clash between India and China in Galwan Valley, that was, I don't think many people outside of India grasped this, that was the most serious clash between the two militaries since 1962, if you measure it in terms of the number of casualties from that. So this, I don't mean to underestimate the seriousness of these unresolved border issues, and so they're likely to continue, but I think they're manageable, at least on the China-India disputed boundary, because neither side has any interest in seeing this dispute escalate to a major conventional war. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I just like to mention that India, on its part, actually has resolved its boundary, land and maritime boundary with Bangladesh. And we certainly look forward to resolving this boundary dispute both with Pakistan and China. With that, I want to just read out to our audience your message. I quote, "We thank our audience for the overwhelming questions. We will not be taking any more questions. Thank you very much. And we'd like to have a round of applause from all our